But none of this meant much to the sans-culottes who, with their Girondin enemies out of the way, were now preoccupied once more with the supply of foodstuffs and other basic commodities. By the second week in June, Paris was full of complaints against butchers and the price of meat. By the third week, there were renewed fears for the bread supply as rumors came in from Normandy that the rebels in the Calvados would attempt to blockade the Seine. Roux, Varlet, and the Enragés, frustrated in their desire for a more radical purge on 2nd June, now sought to capitalize on this continuing unrest. Roux proposed at the Cordeliers that the new constitution should include a mandatory death sentence for usurers and speculators. Liberty, he declared, does not consist in starving your fellow men. On the 25th, he led a deputation from the more radical sections to the convention, where he denounced the deputies for their inaction on hoarding and speculation, and suggested that they, and the Montagnards in particular, were scarcely better in such matters than the despots of old. The outraged deputies threw him out, but attacks by women that very day on soap suppliers, whose stocks they sold at their own prices, showed that he was articulating real grievances. The Montagnards made a determined attempt to break Roux and destroy his influence. They were able to dislodge him from office as editor of the Commune's news sheet and engineer his expulsion from one of his power bases at the Cordeliers. Marat, the vehement friend of the people, though now debilitated by a skin disease, only relieved by constant bathing, was persuaded to denounce the Enragés and all they stood for. But such infighting among the victors of 2nd June was brought to an abrupt halt in mid-July when federalism struck its first, and as it turned out, only blow in Paris. Rumors of tens of thousands of Marseillais, Lyonnais, and Bordelais marching on the capital had been current for weeks. But it was a single, determined emissary from Cayenne, acting on her own, who visited Girondin revenge on their most ferocious adversary. On the 13th, Charlotte Corday stabbed Marat to death in his bath. Here was a new Montagnard martyr, and a much greater one than Le Pelletier or Chalier. News of whose grisly end in from Lyon a few days later. All of his ferocity, Marat had only been influential since the previous summer. And thanks to his illness, his great days were already over. But loss of his counterweight against the Enragés seemed serious. Even if the initial impact of his murder was to stun the sans-culottes. It seems to have galvanized the Montagnards into more positive action. They made the most of their martyr, of course. On 8th of August, they even paraded his widow before the convention to denounce the Enragés as agents of Austria and England. But the realization was now dawning. As disaster upon disaster was reported from the war fronts and from rebel departments, that much more ruthless and determined action would be required if the crisis facing the Republic was to be overcome. Problems of government would soon have to be taken more seriously. Danton, suspected of excessive trimming, had already been voted off the Committee of Public Safety on 10th of July. So had his right-hand man Delacroix. 2 weeks later, 26 July, convinced at last of its value, Robespierre accepted nomination to the committee, noting to himself that its priorities must be food supplies and popular laws. A law against hoarding passed that very day, making it a capital offense, seemed just what was needed. The new Constitution, too, appeared to have achieved its purpose. The primary assemblies endorsed it by an official 1,801,918 votes against 11,610. In fact, the numbers voting for it were probably nearer 2 millions. A respectable enough turnout at a time of civil war, and an indication that the propitiatory gesture of national consultation had achieved some success. The promulgation ceremony on 10th of August, therefore, went ahead as planned, with a huge procession wending its way through Paris, to where 83 pikes, one brought from each department by a patriot ripe in years, were bound into a huge fasces symbolizing Republican unity. The Constitution itself was deposited in a cedar box and suspended from the roof of the convention hall. Theoretically, the convention's work was now done. like the Constituent Assembly before it could dissolve itself and make way for regular constitutional government. Delacroix proposed just this on the 11th. That same night, however, Robespierre denounced a proposal which could only bring to power the envoys of Pitt and Coburg. The current emergency, when the very survival of the Republic was at stake, was not the time to increase political uncertainties. The Constitution could not safely be brought into force in time of war. So long as the emergency lasted, it would remain suspended in every sense. Chapter 11, Government by Terror, 1793 to 1794. July 1793 was the low point in the Jacobin Republic's struggle against its enemies. All the military news was bad. The forces of the coalition were established on French soil in Flanders and along the Pyrenees. Thousands of French troops surrendered when Mainz fell, while a British fleet cruised off Marseille, hoping to link up with the Federalist rebels there. Nor was news from the interior much better. The Vendéens' retreat from Nantes only seemed to consolidate their grip on the heartland of the rebellion. The only general successful against them, Biron, took Saumur. But was dismissed on 12th of July under suspicion as a former duke. He was replaced by his sans-culotte deputy Rossignol, politically sound but a drunken incompetent. And whereas the Federalist revolt in Normandy rapidly collapsed after Brécourt, Lyon proclaimed its continued defiance with the execution of Chalier, and Toulon, hitherto loyal, became a new centre of resistance. Charlotte Corday was denounced as the agent of a far-flung Girondin plot, and after her execution on 17 July, she was adopted as a martyr by a whole spectrum of anti-Montagnards, from moderates to royalists. It was feared that she was one of thousands operating in the capital. Suspicions fanned by political struggles in some of the sections. Not all of them were in the grip of solid sans-culotte. Control of some at the western end of the city changed hands almost nightly. And when the elections were held for the post of commander of the Paris National Guard, Henriot was only confirmed after massive gerrymandering against a candidate who had fired on the Republican petitioners in the Champ de Mars. "The evil which besets us," declared Jean-Bon Saint-André on 1st August, "is that we have no government." As a member of the Committee of Public Safety, he ought to have known. But when Danton proposed in the same session that the committee be recognized formally as France's provisional government, the convention would not agree. The committee seemed adequate for its purpose without taking any new powers. And with the addition to its ranks on 11 August of 2 experienced military technocrats, Carnot and Prieur de la Côte d'Or, the latter just released from Federalist clutches in Cayenne, it now set about vindicating the convention's confidence. It never did become the government or enjoy undisputed executive authority. But in the course of the next 12 months, it was to give the country the leadership to mobilize its resources with unprecedented assurance and put the crisis of 1793 behind it. The first step was to defeat the Federalists, or rather, those who were not already managing to defeat themselves. No further military operations were necessary in Calvados after Brécourt. The disgusted Bretons marched out of Cayenne on 25th July, along with the fugitive Girondin deputies, leaving the city to its fate. By 3rd of August, a representative on mission and member of the Committee of Public Safety, Robert Lindet, was in control again. Nor did the Bretons hold out long. In mid-August, they issued public retractions of their earlier defiant proclamations, and the fugitive deputies moved on again, making their way south to what they imagined would be the safety of Bordeaux. Bitter disappointment awaited them. Resistance was collapsing in the Gironde, too. In the last week of July, the Popular Commission still seemed very much in charge, seizing all the coinage in the local mint to defray its mounting expenses. Then on 2nd August, alarmed by threats of military vengeance issuing from Paris and mounting problems of food supply, it abruptly dissolved itself and recalled its volunteer army. If it hoped to fend off Montagnard vengeance, it was to be disappointed. Although none of the money was used, the raid on the mint was viewed as theft of national property. Besides, ever since its establishment, the committee had been the source of much virulent and anti-Parisian propaganda, and had dispatched emissaries to foment federalism all over the South and West. Its contribution, in fact, to the national crisis was regarded as far more damaging than that of Cayenne or Rennes, and retribution was accordingly going to be far more drastic. On 6th of August, all members of the Popular Commission were declared traitors and outlawed. Representatives on mission arrived on 19 August to restore legitimate authority, but they did not find the cowed and contrite city they expected. Jostled and threatened by ugly crowds of muscadines, they felt safer withdrawing the next day to the Republican safety of La Réole, 30 miles up the river. From there, they reported their reception to the convention and called for troops to accompany their next entry to the city. Not until 17 October did they feel secure enough to attempt it. But by then, Bordeaux had been bracing itself for several weeks. On 27 August, the National Club reopened, and 3 weeks later, a new Jacobin-dominated municipal council was elected. A festival in honor of Marat had even been held, but remarked Tallien, the deputy now sent from the Vendée to deal with Bordeaux, "This is pure face-saving. Hunger and fear alone have brought the 28 sections together, even for a minute." Similar pressures also precipitated the surrender of Marseille. Detachments from the army in the Alps were ordered in July to march against both Marseille and Lyon. By the beginning of August, Lyon was surrounded, but seemed bent on resistance. Marseille, however, now cut off from sympathizers further up the Rhone, began to panic. The departmental army of the Bouches-du-Rhône withdrew from Avignon, pursued by regular troops under Carteau. With the port blockaded and the new harvest not yet in, bread riots broke out in the city in the early days of August. The Popular Tribunal began to execute known Jacobins, and priests reappeared in public praying for divine aid to save the rebels. Finally, as Carteau's army closed in, the rebels appealed to the British Admiral Hood to allow grain shipments from Italy to pass his blockade. This was treason, and it proved too much for some Marseille sections to follow. Fighting broke out on 23rd August between advocates of surrender to Carteau and the partisans of collaboration with the British. 2 days later, Carteau arrived. Those who could made their escape to Toulon, where they had a dramatic effect on the situation. The Toulon Federalists had had no previous thoughts of collaboration with the enemy, even though they knew that if Carteau took Marseille, their own turn must come. But, surprised by the approach from Marseille, Hood concluded that Toulon might be ripe for negotiation too. On 23rd August, accordingly, he formally offered Toulon military protection if the port would proclaim Louis XVII. Many were outraged, but others were equally appalled by atrocity stories spread by refugees from Marseille. After agonized debate, the sections decided to accept Hood's offer. It took another 3 days to persuade the sailors of the Mediterranean fleet that resistance at this stage would be futile. But on 27 August, the British fleet sailed into France's Mediterranean naval base, and coalition forces occupied the town. They met with no resistance. The fall of Toulon and to the British precipitated a new crisis in Paris. Ever since the death of Marat, various factions in the capital had been jostling to appropriate his mantle and his following. Hence the venom and persistence of the Montagnard attack on the Enragés. But no sooner had Roux been dislodged from influence at the Commune than others came forward to appropriate his program. The New Populists had until now been orthodox spokesmen for Montagnard policies in the Commune, in the person of Chaumette, its procurator, and Hébert, his deputy. And at the War Ministry, they also dominated the Cordeliers Club. Hébert's Père Duchesne, written in the oath-strewn vernacular, became the undisputed best-selling paper in Paris once Marat was silenced. It also began, after that, to call for sterner measures against hoarders and speculators, the extension of the maximum to all goods of first necessity, along with stricter enforcement, faster progress in the organization of the revolutionary armies decreed on 2nd June, and greater efforts to marshal the people's revolutionary enthusiasm through mass effort. These demands were barely distinguishable from those still being made by Roux and his journalist ally Leclerc, who had even given his own paper Marat's old name of L'Ami du Peuple. Both groups believed that only ruthless use of the guillotine would eliminate traitors, backsliders, suspects, speculators, and egoists. The answer to the nation's problems lay in terror. Even in the convention, this cry was increasingly being heard. Deputies like the ferocious Billaud Varennes, who had moved the death penalty for hoarding, and his close ally Collot d'Herboise, former actor and already known as a ruthlessly efficient representative on mission, increasingly stood out from their fellow Montagnards in spurning caution and conciliation. And the Committee of Public Safety did authorize some popular gestures. The Levée en masse, proclaimed on 23rd August, was a response to a petitioning campaign from the sections. But stirringly as Carnot's prose read and spectacularly effective as his implementation of the decree was to be, the conscription it authorized fell far short of the universal national enlistment dreamed of in the sections. The nation's resolve, Leclerc proclaimed, was being sapped by a spirit of moderation in the convention that needed to be expunged, if necessary, by the sort of popular action already seen on 2nd June. Hébert defeated to his great surprise in a bid to be elected Minister of the Interior on 20th August, seized on the same theme and began to work the Jacobin Club up to accepting it. Economic circumstances favored him. Over the summer, the assignat had continued to decline, reaching a mere 22% of its face value in August, a loss of 14% since the purge of the Girondins alone. Weeks of hot weather had produced a good harvest, but many watermills were becalmed by drought, so flour remained scarce. All basic goods had risen in price since June, and some quite spectacularly. Soap was up threefold. For all this, moderates and dozers, endormeurs in the convention were blamed. And when on 2nd September, news arrived of the loss of Toulon, it was easy to focus popular anger on them. Billaud Varennes had already come close to condemning the incompetence of the Committee of Public Safety with a proposal for a new committee to supervise ministers. So when what appears to have originated as a spontaneous demonstration by manual workers for higher wages and more bread broke out on 4th September, Hébert and his allies at the Commune and in the clubs were quick to turn it to their advantage. Confronted by crowds in the Place de Grève, they persuaded them to reassemble on the 5th for a march on the convention. They used their official powers to close all workplaces the next day. And that evening, they persuaded the Jacobins to back their initiative, brushing aside the temporizings of Robespierre, who as current president of the convention would have the task of confronting the morning's demonstration. There was certainly no hope of resisting it. Chaumette, at the head of thousands of sans-culottes, denounced the shortages, the failure to implement existing laws to deal with them, and those who caused them. Legislators, the immense gathering of citizens come together yesterday and this morning has formed but one wish, brought to you by a deputation. It is this: our subsistence, and to get it, apply the law. That meant, first of all, organizing the revolutionary armies and launching them against the hoarders and greedy, unpatriotic inhabitants of the countryside. The convention voted to do it on the spot, although it did not authorize the guillotines on wheels which Chaumette thought every detachment of the new force ought to have. The motion was moved by Billaud Varennes and seconded by Danton. Danton also moved that arms production be stepped up until every patriot had a musket, that the Revolutionary Tribunal be divided so as to get through more business, and that, as he put it, to permit hard-working men who live by the price of their sweat to attend their sectional assemblies. These assemblies should take place twice weekly, and attendance at them be paid at 40 sous a time. It was all carried by acclamation amid scenes, in Barère's words, of delirium. Terror, he observed, was now the order of the day. The sans-culottes appeared to have coerced the convention for the second time in 3 months, and to be set to dictate its policies without resistance. Over the next few weeks, the legislature certainly committed itself to radical and energetic action on a scale not seen since the emergency of March. Billaud-Varenne and Collot-d'Herboise were now added to the Committee of Public Safety. Although Damon refused nomination. On 17 September, a comprehensive law of suspects was passed, which empowered the watch committees to set up the previous March to arrest anyone who either by their conduct, their contacts, their words, or their writings showed themselves to be supporters of tyranny or federalism, or to be enemies of liberty, as well as a number of more specific categories, such as former nobles who have not constantly manifested their attachment to the revolution. Practically anybody might fall foul of such a sweeping law. In the weeks following, even everyday speech acquired a sans-culotte style. Those who refused to call each other citizen, rather than the deferential monsieur, and to use the familiar form of address, tutoiement, fell under automatic suspicion. Then, on 29 September, the convention passed a general maximum law, which imposed price controls on a wide range of goods, defined as of first necessity from food and drink to fuel, clothing, and even tobacco. Those who sold them above the maximum price would be fined and placed on the list of suspects. The revolutionary army was at last set on foot, and command of it went not, as the Committee of Public Safety would have liked, to Henriot, but to Ronsin, one of the fiercest allies of Hébert. Ever since June, many sections had also been calling for the Girondins, still in captivity, to be put on trial, along with Marie Antoinette. Such gestures were bloody, since acquittal was inconceivable, but empty. As Robespierre saw, he campaigned against them and sought to impede them as long as he could. But on 9 September, news broke of a plot to free the former queen from the solitary confinement in which she was now kept. and after that, her fate was inevitable. She was sent for trial on 3rd October, the same day as the Girondins. All Robespierre could do was dissuade the convention from the roll call demanded by Billaud-Varenne to identify those favoring mercy for traitors. The first well-known victims of the Reign of Terror, however, came from the other end of the political spectrum. The radicals used their triumph to eliminate the rivals whose policies they had stolen. In the course of September, the leading enragés were all arrested. Roux, first imprisoned as early as August 2nd, 22nd August, then released, was re-arrested on 5th September. Valette, who with some prescience announced Danton's idea of payment for attendance at fixed weekly sectional meetings, followed him into custody on the 18th. Leclerc stopped publishing and disappeared. No more was now heard of the call, periodically taken up by the enragés, for the Constitution to be brought into force, with all its democratic practices and implicit renewal of the national representation. Quite the reverse. On 10th October, the convention formally accepted that it was impossible to activate it as things were. At a time of emergency, the processes it enshrined were too cumbersome and slow. "It is impossible," declared Saint Just in the name of the Committee of Public Safety, "for revolutionary laws to be executed if the government itself is not constituted in a revolutionary way." He therefore proposed that the committee itself should take on the central direction of the entire state apparatus, subject only to the oversight of the convention. Such revolutionary government would be temporary, but the government of France was declared revolutionary until the peace. Thus began the most famous stage of the French Revolution, when in the course of 9 months, around 16,000 people perished under the blade of the guillotine. The cold, mechanical efficiency of the method had all Europe watching with fascinated horror. The terror began and ended far into 1794 with famous victims. Marie Antoinette went to the scaffold. Her defiant appearance in the tumbril memorably sketched by David on 17 October. 2 weeks later, 31st October, 21 Girondins, including Brissot and Vergniaud, followed her. After a show trial cut short, when the eloquence and debating skills of the accused threatened to prolong it indefinitely, they went to their deaths defiantly singing the Marseillaise. Those who had signed the secret protest against their purging in June were imprisoned as Girondins after its existence was revealed in the preparations for the trial. But Robespierre always blocked moves to have them too put on trial. Of those, who had escaped in June. 4 went to the guillotine in Bordeaux, while Pétion and Buzot shot themselves. Their bodies were later found, half eaten by wolves. Roland, too, committed suicide when he heard of his wife's execution in November. November also saw the execution of Égalité, no Girondin, but a prince of royal blood with an émigré son, and suspect figures from the past, like Barnave, arrested a year previously when his 1791 intrigues with the Queen were revealed, and Bailey, still hated by the sans-culottes for his part in the massacre of the Champ de Mars. For him, a special guillotine was erected at the scene of the crime. The others all met their deaths where the guillotine now permanently stood, close to where Louis XVI's head had fallen in the Place de la Révolution. Even so, only 177 people were executed in Paris between October and the end of 1793. The pathetic spectacle of the once mighty and famous now brought low distracted attention from the thousands of less well-known provincials who made up the bulk of the terror's victims. Just as the show trials in Paris were beginning, Lyon finally surrendered to the besieging Ummies after 2 months of bombardment and resistance, during which its defense was increasingly reliant on royalist volunteers commanded by a returned émigré. Hoping to be relieved by a Piedmontese invasion from the east, the starving city held out over the summer. But when the first few days of October, the invaders were thrown back, defeat became inevitable, and Lyon surrendered to the representative on mission, Couthon. His inclination was to adopt the policy of conciliation and clemency that had worked so effectively in Cayenne over the summer. But Lyon was different. The country's second city had defied the convention for a third of the year, when the Republic was in mortal peril. It had murdered Chalier and not hesitated to make common cause with other rebels, not to mention royalists and foreign enemies. The city's name was reviled in Paris for more than those of the other Federalist centres, and the Committee of Public Safety was resolved to make Lyon an example. On receipt of the news of its fall on 12th October, the committee moved a decree that Lyon should be destroyed. Its very name was to disappear, except on a monument among the ruins, which would proclaim, "Lyon made war on liberty. Lyon is no more." the collection of houses left standing. For the destruction of the city was glossed later in the decree as the destruction of the houses of the rich, was to be renamed Freedtown, Ville Affranchie. Couthon had no stomach for such comprehensive vengeance. He set up special courts and began to demolish some of the city's richest dwellings. But at the same time, he asked to be transferred elsewhere. He was replaced at the beginning of November by Collot d'Herbois and Fouché, the latter previously on mission in Nevers. They came determined to exact the exemplary vengeance decreed from Paris, and to help them, they brought units of the Paris Revolutionary Army, now fully organized under the direct authority of the Committee of Public Safety. Thousands of suspects were imprisoned as parties of sans-culottes swept the city with domiciliary visits. But by the end of November, scarcely more than 200 Federalists had been condemned by the special courts. Culotte thought a mere 20 deaths a day not enough. On 27 November, a special tribunal of 7 was established to speed up matters, and within days had handed down capital sentences on almost 300 convicted rebels. This was too much for the local guillotine. In the Mitraillade of 4th through 8 December, condemned men were blown into open graves by cannon fire and grape shot. Even so, executions continued into the spring. By April, 1,880 Lyonnese had been condemned, arriving in the city with a detachment of the Paris Revolutionary Army on 22nd January. A German adventurer who had joined them gazed in horror at whole ranges of houses, always the most handsome, burnt. The churches, convents, and all the dwellings of the former patricians were in ruins. When I came to the guillotine, the blood of those who had been executed a few hours beforehand was still running in the street. I said to a group of sans-culottes that it would be decent to clear away all this human blood. Why should it be cleared? One of them said to me, it's the blood of aristocrats and rebels. The dogs should lick it up. The troops who had taken Lyon had meanwhile moved on south to join the armies encircling Toulon. The coalition forces occupying the port were not reinforced, and so had done little to enlarge their bridgehead. But They could keep supplied from the sea so long as they occupied the heights around the harbor. Thus, the siege of Toulon went on for 3.5 months. But when, on 17 December, Captain Bonaparte's gunners drove the British and Spanish troops from the key forts on those heights, Admiral Hood saw that he must evacuate the port immediately or have his fleet shot to matchwood. Perhaps 7,000 refugees crowded onto the warships, which sailed out over the next 3 days under Republican fire, including most of the leaders of Toulon's original revolt. Nevertheless, the Jacobins released from imprisonment were able to identify plenty of remaining rebels. 800 were shot without trial as French citizens caught in armed rebellion. A revolutionary commission set up by the representatives Barras, a former noble, and Fréron condemned 282 more to the guillotine over the next month for conniving at a revolt that had not only proclaimed Louis XVII, but also allowed the enemy to tow off or destroy over 2/3 of the French Mediterranean fleet as the occupation ended. Mountain Port, Port de la Montagne, as it was now renamed, therefore suffered second only to Lyon in the terror which purged the centres of federalism. Only its vital strategic importance as a naval base cushioned it from further reprisals. Repression at Marseille and Bordeaux, in comparison, was relatively mild, well controlled and formally meticulous. The Revolutionary Tribunal, which sat at Marseille between August 1793 and April 1794, tried 975 suspects and acquitted 476 of them. 289 of those convicted were executed, although, of course, many of the most guilty must have escaped to Toulon before Carteau's forces marched in. Even the attempt to give the city the new name of nameless Saint-Nom was half-hearted. Bordeaux kept its own name throughout, although the Gironde department where it lay was redesignated Bec-Dam, from the point where Garonne and Dordogne meet. Despite bloodthirsty language from the representatives Tallien and Isabeau, the military commission they established acquitted more suspects than it condemned. Between October 1793 and June 1794, only 104 were sentenced to the guillotine. So moderate had the repression been that the representatives themselves fell under suspicion. Isabeau seemed too fond of the company of rich merchants, while Tallien was under the thumb of his beautiful, pleasure-loving mistress. Thérèse Cabarrus, the wife of a noble and herself daughter of a dubious Spanish financier. They were supplemented in June 1794 by a young, austere acolyte of Robespierre, Julien, and in the 2 months of his rule, 198 more heads rolled at Bordeaux. By then, the terror was tailing off everywhere else except in Paris. Julien was chosen to go to Bordeaux on the strength of his success in uncovering terroristic abuses in Nantes under the representative sent there in October 1793, Carrier. Nantes by then was the main centre of operations against the Vendée, and bursting with prisoners as the war began to turn against the rebels. After their failure to take the great port in the first days of July, the whites melted back into the countryside. A Republican counter-offensive began, spearheaded by regular troops who had surrendered at Mainz and been repatriated by the coalition on condition of not being put back in the line. They and a legion of sans-culotte volunteers from Paris under Rossignol now carried a deliberate policy of terror and devastation into the Vendéan heartland. The rebels rapidly abandoned Saumur and Angers, and their leaders fell to quarreling about who should have overall command. Reactivated by messages from London that the British would send them aid if they could capture a port, they regrouped and defeated the Parisian army at Caronne on 18 September and the Mainz veterans at Torfu the next day. But characteristically afterwards, most of the rebels went home to sing Te Deums instead of pursuing their advantage. Early in October, the Committee of Public Safety launched a new drive to crush the inexplicable Vendée, as Barrère called it. Command of the various Republican armies was unified. And by mid-October, 4 columns were converging on the very headquarters of rebel territory, the Bocage around Cholet. There, on 17 October, they defeated the rebels decisively and killed several of their leaders. Only now, pursued by triumphant Republicans, did the Vendéens break out of their home country in a bold and desperate bid to link up with the British. They crossed the Loire and struck north under Stouflet, making for the nearest port to British territory, Granville on the Cotentin Peninsula opposite Jersey. As they went, they were joined by the Chouans from the disaffected countryside of Upper Brittany. And by the time they reached Granville on 14 November, They may have been 60,000 strong. But the British were not there. There were plenty of troops and supplies in Jersey, but news of the march only reached their commander via London on 26 November. And even then, he did not know that Granville was their destination. The port was well fortified and defended, whereas the Vendéens had no siege train. By the time British warships appeared off Granville on 2nd December, the rebel army was in retreat far to the south. By the 4th, they were once more at Angers, but this time, the Republican garrison held firm, and they were unable to get back across the Loire. They turned north again, and on 12 December, Republican forces at last caught up with them at Le Mans, where they were routed in a night battle fought in pouring winter rain. Many escaped, but in complete disorder. Westerman, in command of the Blues pursuing them westwards back to Brittany, ordered no quarter to be given. "The road to Laval is strewn with corpses," reported one of his men. "Women, priests, monks, children, all have been put to death. I have spared nobody." Perhaps 10,000 died during this retreat. On 23rd December, finally, the remnant of the Catholic and Royal Army turned to face its pursuers at Savigny. Only 4,000 of 5,000 were left in any state to fight, although twice that number were crammed into the little town. Two-thirds of them were destroyed in the battle and the mass shootings which followed. The Great War of the Vendée was over, but Republican vengeance was not. In a macabre but untranslatable pun, the area was now to be called Vengey. Over the spring of 1794, General Turreau sent infernal columns of blues to crisscross the heartland of rebellion, ravaging, destroying, and killing everything in their path. "Comrades," declared one of his subordinates to his men, "we are entering insurgent country. I order you to deliver to flames everything that can be burnt, and to bayonet any locals whom you meet on your way. I know there might be a few patriots in this country. Never mind, we must sacrifice them all." Even Republican troops, sickened by scenes of gang rape and infanticide, dared not protest. Historians are still arguing about how many people perished during the whole episode of the Vendée uprising. But 250,000 on the rebel side alone does not seem an overestimate. Certainly, the population of the region did not recover to its 1790 levels until the 1820s. Alongside casualties on this scale, even the number of victims who perished in the judicial terror of Nantes seems modest. Yet nowhere else was the terror so destructive. 42% of the death sentences during the entire terror were passed in the three departments most affected by the Vendée Rebellion, and the various special courts established in the Loire Inférieure. Nantes Department accounted for 3,548 capital sentences. Carrier, whose previous record at Rennes, dealing with mere Federalists, had been moderate and conciliatory, believed that fanatical royalist counter-revolutionaries deserved far harsher treatment. As at Lyon, the guillotine could scarcely cope with the flood of victims. Yet the prisons were overflowing, ravaged by epidemics, and there was not enough food to feed innocent citizens, let alone condemned traitors and rebels. These considerations led Carrier to approve perhaps the most notorious expedient of the whole terror, the noyade. On 19 November, some 90 priests were executed by sinking them, hogtied, in a holed barge in the Loire. In the 6 weeks that followed, 6 other batches of victims, many though not all of them non-juring priests convicted or sometimes just suspected of exciting the fanaticism of devout rebels, were disposed of in the same way. Perhaps 1,800 perished altogether in the noyade, and their bodies were washed up on the tidal banks of the Loire for weeks afterwards. But the citizens of Nantes, repeatedly threatened by insurgents who reputedly gave no quarter, raised little objection to such methods, or to the hundreds of shootings of armed rebels that Carrier also authorized. They believed they would have been massacred if the whites had triumphed. The Vendée Rebellion had begun, after all, with massacres of good Republicans. And hardly any Nantais were executed under Carrier. What brought him down and precipitated his recall to Paris on 8 February was rumors of the sheer scale of his operations in Nantes at a time when the Committee of Public Safety was beginning to wonder, however temporarily, whether ferocity was not now making the Republic more enemies than it eliminated. In this climate, subordinate terrorists in Nantes were anxious to blame the representative on mission for as much excess as possible. And Julien, as the confidant of the always suspicious Robespierre, was a willing recipient of their denunciations. Repression under Carrier, Julien reported, had been indiscriminate, and too often the letter of the law had been ignored. Official policy was now set to severe limits to the independent initiative of representatives on mission, and Carrier was the first and most spectacular casualty of the changed atmosphere. Throughout the autumn of 1793, however, representatives on mission had been free to interpret their role much as they wished. This phase of the terror was anarchic, uncoordinated, and little subject to central direction. Its characteristic instruments were the revolutionary armies, which mushroomed throughout the provinces, in imitation of that of Paris, in whose numbers may have reached 40,000 men at their height. Terroristic jacks of all trades, their purpose was to intimidate and punish, arrest and repress anyone suspected of activities that could be deemed hostile to the revolution. Representatives arriving in districts suspected of disaffection tended to establish such forces as a matter of priority, as rallying points for active and reliable patriots. Overwhelmingly, they were recruited in towns among married artisans, and they tended to operate locally. The Paris bataillons sent to Lyon were exceptional. Local knowledge, in fact, was essential to their functioning. They knew who the suspects were and where to find them. And recruited as they were, it was not surprising that they spent much of their time foraging in surrounding countryside, hunting down hoarders and speculators whose greed threatened to starve hungry patriot families in the towns and flouted the law of the maximum. The same local knowledge underpinned the powers of the watch committees sitting in most localities since the spring. Onto them devolved the responsibility of implementing the law of suspects, passed in September, as well as a whole range of other duties, such as issuing certificates of civisme, identity cards, and testimonials of public reliability, all in one. Originally, only foreigners had been required to carry these documents, but the law of suspects made the requirement general. Those without them were liable to arrest and imprisonment. And in fact, up to 500,000 people may have been imprisoned as suspects of one sort or another during the terror. Up to 10,000 may have died in custody, crowded into prisons never intended for such numbers, or makeshift quarters no better equipped. These, too, deserve to be numbered among the victims of the terror. Although not formally condemned, so do those who were murdered or lynched without trial or official record during the chaotic, violent autumn of 1793, when the supreme law of public safety seemed to override more conventional and cumbersome procedures. Altogether, the true total of those who died under the terror, excluding the Vendée, may have been twice the official figure, around 30,000 people in just under a year. Even so, it was far from the bloodiest episode in a murderous decade for Europe. The same number died in a matter of weeks in Ireland in 1798, in a country with only 1/6 of France's population, while 2/3 of that number may have been slaughtered in a single day in Warsaw on the 4th of November 1794. Nor is it true that most of those killed in the terror were members of the formal privileged orders, whatever the revolution's anti-aristocratic rhetoric might suggest. Of the official death sentences passed, less than 9% fell upon nobles, and less than 7% on the clergy. Disproportionately high as these figures may have been relative to the numbers of these groups in the population as a whole, they were not as high as the quarter of the terror's victims who came from the middle classes. And the vast majority of those who lost their lives in the proscriptions of 1793-94, two-thirds of those officially condemned, and doubtless a far higher proportion of those who disappeared unofficially, were ordinary people caught up in tragic circumstances not of their own making, who made wrong choices in lethal times, when indifference itself counted as a crime. It is scarcely a coincidence that most death sentences were passed in areas of Federalist or Royalist rebellion, or in frontier districts where the repeated passage of opposed armies demanded rapid but ultimately unconvincing changes of allegiance from those who lived there. Other districts, meanwhile, particularly in the center of the country, remained almost untouched by the terror. Here, even more than in disturbed areas, the personal whims and idiosyncrasies of representatives on mission could be decisive. Sometimes they could even set an example that would be widely followed. The Nièvre, for example, deep in central France, had given the convention no cause for worry, but the arrival there in September 1793 of the representative Fouché transformed it into a beacon of religious terror. Fouché, himself a former priest, came from the Vendée, where he had witnessed the ability of the clergy to inspire fanatical resistance to the Republic's authority. Christianity, he concluded, could not coexist in any form with the Revolution, and brushing aside what was left of the Constitutional Church, he inaugurated a civic religion of his own devising with a feast of Brutus on 22nd September, at which he denounced religious sophistry. Fouché particularly deplored clerical celibacy. It set the clergy apart, and in any case made no contribution to society's need for children. Clerics who refused to marry were ordered to adopt and support orphans or aged citizens. The French people, Fouché declared in a manifesto published on 10 October, recognized no other cult but that of universal morality. And although the exercise of all creeds was proclaimed as free and equal, none might henceforth be practiced in public. Graveyards should exhibit no religious symbols, and at the gate of each would be an inscription proclaiming, "Death is an eternal sleep." Thus began the movement known as de-Christianization. Soon afterwards, Fouché moved on to Lyon, but during his weeks in Nevers, his work had been watched by Chaumet, visiting his native town from Paris. He was to carry the idea back to the capital, where it was energetically taken up by his colleagues at the Commune.